I could do with that right now. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. It is Wednesday, February 5th. And thank you, Tom. And we are going to begin the day again addressing some of the housing challenges and opportunities, because this project also represents some of the opportunities with housing in Vermont. And to do that today, we are welcoming Zeke Davison, who will introduce himself and take it away. I think you have met everybody now.
Yes, I think Senator Weeks the only one we've met. Senator Chittenden.
So Zeke, it is yours. And congratulations on your groundbreaking on Monday.
Yeah, so Zeke Davison, CEO of Summit Properties. We're the largest private developer of affordable housing mixed in communities in Vermont. Got our start in the 1970s in Middlebury. Actually, we're sort of coming back to our roots, if you will. Found the low-income housing tax credit program and did one of the first LIHTC projects in Vermont in the mid-90s. Our founders did about a 2-decade span where they were developing independent senior living communities using the low-income housing tax credit project or program. One community in South Burlington, one community in Rutland, 2 in New Hampshire, West Lebanon and Bow, 1 in Queensbury, New York. Did the
Glen? Did they do the Glen?
It's the Cedars. Cedars Senior Living, yeah.
And which in South, and did they do Wake Park?
Nope, the Pines Senior Living Community was where our office is, South Burlington, and then the Maples by the hospital in Rutland. They did a tax credit historic preservation project in St. Johnsbury. So we're all over the state of Vermont, and then 3 communities outside of the state. The last 10 years has been doing multifamily, so not age restricted, sort of the classic, what you heard Kathy talk about is the tax credit multifamily project. And I watched the testimony from Friday, and I will try to build on that at times.
Great.
But I'm so grateful that you had Maura and Kathy and Polly and everybody in here first. It takes years to learn this, so to expect that even after hearing it 4th or 5th time, you can understand. Yes.
Good.
Yeah. What Senator Clarkson was referring to is we had a groundbreaking of what is the largest new neighborhood development project outside of Chittenden County in a long time in the state. We have a 254 unit master planned community in Middlebury. This project has started as a partnership with the college. We used a lot of ARPA funding through ACCD to do a lot of the infrastructure. We received significant missing middle home ownership opportunity from VHFA, a low-income housing tax credit award, soft sources from VHCB. I mean, it is the true representation of every possible source of affordable housing. And it's allowed us to break ground on the first 80 units. We're building the infrastructure to support many more than that.
And some of what we did in this committee to reduce regulatory barriers was helpful. And Zeke was also instructive in helping us understand where those are.
Yeah.
And how one word can delay a project 3 months all by itself, a word like subdivision, which we had to fix again.
So I've spent most of my time over the last 2 sessions here testifying on the Act 250 work, right? And what we held up as a project that could benefit from an Act 250 exemption, first under, 2 sessions ago, it was the Homes Act, right? And then last year it was Act 181. So, I won't get too technical, but there was the population-based cap for the priority housing projects. Middlebury's under 10,000 people. It's at 9,400. So
arbitrary barriers,
but also I think when we talk about duplication, when we talk about necessary processes, unnecessary processes, if you're doing affordable housing, you're going to go through a really stringent environmental review for your federal funding. If you're going in a town that has professional bylaws, you're going to go through a really stringent zoning. And that is, when we talk about what makes Act 250 duplicative, that is genuinely, this was like the perfect case scenario. And I'm not here to talk about it today, but the risk of appeal is really what is the silencing chilling effect on those projects. It's not the cost and the delay you can plan for. And I heard Kathy say this, and I've said this so many more times in the last 2 years. It's a cost and a delay that's real. But what you can't quantify is the risk of appeals. And that just has such a chilling effect. I'm always asked whenever I went Senate, natural resources or House, it's like, how many units could you have built? Like, what is quantify the cost? And you really can't.
Mm-hmm.
All you can talk about is vacancy rates, homelessness rates, and how far behind we are in the housing need. And you can point to a lot of things. Act 250 is one of them. I should get off my Act 250 soapbox.
Yeah, because as you know, this not our committee's
not
jurisdiction,
your-
although
It is our
important for
committee's
us.
jurisdiction, absolutely. We spent 2 years making
No.
sure Tier 1, A and B are economic development and housing areas. It is
Right.
this committee's jurisdiction.
Actually, we will have discussion about that, but Thomas.
You are preaching to the choir, my
Right.
friend, but I would like to just tease apart one thing I heard you say is one, I think Act 250 keeps a lot of money at bay. So that uncertainty prevents the development and the investment into Vermont from
Mhm.
those that just don't know the system. The other problem is those that do know the system, developers that know how Act 250 is and commit to projects, the carrying costs you just described, they accept it. They just know there's going to be delays, it's going to take time, and they're baking the costs of that time into our infrastructure, our housing. They're not fucking out of their pocket, they're going into the cost for housing. So I think it's twofold. One, keeping money at bay. Two, increasing the cost of everything we build. Do you agree?
The third one, yes.
Okay.
And the third one is there are only a handful of us that can stomach that pre-development cost.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
That is-
Evernorth, us, and Cathedral Square on the
Right.
affordable side. And it's the names you hear in Chittenden County on the market rate side. It's O'Brien, it's Snyder, it's Braverman, it's, Farrell. I mean, there's
Mhm.
really only a handful of people that will take the risk,
Mhm.
and that's it. And that is such a barrier to entry. Every other developer does 9 units.
Some of you were part of a email thread from last night as we watched in real time a project fall apart in Orleans. It was going to be a cluster of manufactured homes, home ownership opportunities. And all the emails that were forwarded were, they just hired this lawyer. They're going to put you through Act 250. They're going to ask you to do 1 unit per acre on 20 acres instead of getting clustered
Right.
development, which to me says this was never about wetlands or the environment, because then you're just spreading out the development. And it's a real shame because we just lost a lot of homeownership opportunities in Orleans last
Huge.
night.
He had just rescinded.
Just rescinded hours. Yeah, I had wanted to get him on the schedule before so we could
Well,
give him some hope.
It's not like we could.
What we do in a pre-tier 1 regime is if somebody says, I have the perfect place for a project, or would you be interested in looking at a project here? We will pull up the ANR planning atlas. We will hit the layer for all the designated areas. And if the address falls outside of that, we just say no.
Mhm.
And that quite honestly is how we pick projects, because there are enough projects to be done in Act 250 exempt areas that it's not worth the time, effort, and risk. So, I mean, that's like kind of my like stark ultimatum, right?
Mhm.
But I think there's been progress on that. There's a long way to go, but I think it also kind of my theme here today, and I'll kind of go really narrow and then try to broaden back out, is like we are all holding up a mirror to how what we do, the decisions we make, how we govern ourselves, how we allocate money, how we in the affordable housing community talk about what we do. And like the point is not to get defensive or entrenched or anything, but to like say, hold up the mirror to every single process we do and understand what impact we're having, intended, unintended, otherwise, on what we're doing to build housing.
Yeah.
And that sort of gets into, starting granularly here, we did a project with a Middlebury College intern to prepare for the QAP, the Qualified Allocation Plan, and Amora talked to you all about that, which is the sort of governing internal document of how you allocate 9% tax credits. She went through that whole thing about how 9% are competitive, 4% are by right, but 4% are half as valuable. The 9% are competitive rounds. There are only really 4 of us developers in the last 5 to 10 years that are eligible for that, 4 of us that compete. But the QAP hasn't traditionally had, or hasn't had in a while, and we were an outlier in this, some cost criteria. but we had a lot of criteria that would give points to remediate brownfields, to add amenities, to do all this. And we got to a point, and Maura and Kathy have talked about this, where our total development cost per unit is dramatically higher than our neighboring states and our peer states, both of the same demographic and everything. And this is sort of page 2 that I'll flip to in a second.
And I hope your students are watching. It was great to talk
She
to them.
graduated, she's a Fed senior. She graduated on Friday. Didn't come to our grand opening on Monday either, because she's driving back to Texas. This is a week off, but she's still doing work for us through the next 6 months. So
Well, I prepared her for, people might poke holes in your numbers, but it's really great to see students getting involved.
It's super.
and what I want to say about these numbers, and it was the perfect project for her, is these numbers are, why don't I just, I guess we'll get into it, right? These numbers are taken from the applications of all of of successful 9% applications in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont from 2020 to 2024. A lot happens after application, before construction, but it happens in every state. This is as apples to apples, Freedom of Information Act requests from Maine and New Hampshire, because they're not as transparent as VHFA. But this is all the raw data. There's no interpretation in this. This is what's happening. And I think the thing that for us, this was all, and I just want to remind you, to be able to make an effective comment on the QAP, because these numbers were really quite staggering to us. And I'll say at the outset, we submitted a comment based on these numbers using these charts, and the new QAP draft includes competition on cost and eliminated a lot of the cost drivers, right? And Kathy spoke really eloquently about the cost drivers in our QAP. We advocated for some competition on cost, and I think the VHFA held up the mirror too and said, "Yep, we got to get hold of this." I'm going to walk through these. I think this is important context, but the other thing to remember is when we're talking about 7,000 to 8,000 units a year over the next 5 years to get to our 40,000 unit goal, these numbers are about 100 to 200 units a year, right? There are 3 or 4 30-unit tax credit projects that get awards a year. So what we're talking about here is just these 9% deeply subsidized, affordable, big A affordable buildings. It's representative of everything we do here. And as we think about what the internal affordable housing communities work through the QAP is to hold that mirror up and make some changes, for you, it matters on the appropriation side. And I want to get into some of the different choices. The mirror we hold up is, for me, always, how do we build net new units? Period. Right? And Maura did her iceberg visual that I think you all saw, which that's not housing. We're doing all of these things. And then when she was in here on Friday, she passionately said, like, what do you want me to do? Right? Do you want me to build net new units, or do you want me to focus on some of these? And I think there's a shift right now in thinking about net new units. And that would be, I mean, if you walk away with anything, it's how we do everything to talk about net new units. But we have to build our way out of this, and we can't do it 150 affordable units at a time. So total development cost per unit. Vermont is the green line. In 2020, we were building LIHTC units, low-income housing tax credit units, for $300,000 per unit. Maine and New Hampshire were a little more efficient in the 250s, right? We've diverged. We're up over $500,000 per unit. Maine and New Hampshire, where there are many developers competing hard on cost, have been able to keep it at an inflationary growth or less in the affordable housing world. Yeah, and stop me anytime.
Causes for that growth, because Act 250 didn't change in that period of time. Everyone's been subject to the same building construction costs and such.
Yeah, our argument to VHFA was that there were, I think, some unintended consequences of incentives in the QAP. And the QAP you could score points by doing a brownfield project. You could score points by doing a dense infill in a complicated site. You heard Kathy talk about that, or Maura talk about that.
Yeah.
There were policy goals running through the QAP that weren't about net new units. And that is what I think VHFA is addressing in this current QAP.
I'm new. QAP.
Sorry, Qualified Allocation Plan. It's the governing document about how VHFA gives out tax credits. That was that 4% and 9% piece, right? Yeah. Yep. Vermont or Maine and New Hampshire do this on a weighted average. So they take a weighted average of units and bedrooms, and there's another figure for that. Suffice to say that every project in the last several years in Vermont wouldn't have even been eligible to be applied for based on cost in New Hampshire and Maine, because they have a cap. They're problematic pieces of a cap. We can advocate for a cap, but we ask for a path where developers could compete based on efficiency, score points. Don't need to get into QAP. Impressed with VHFA is responding to some of this. We're talking about holding up the mirror. They did that. They're looking at it. And the next QAP, I have some.
And just
hope
remind
for
us, who determines what is considered a QAP? Who is?
It's VHFA. It's the HFA's document. The,
Right.
the allocating
not-
agency. No, it's not. It's not a legislative task. It is.
Right.
It is an HFA task, and that's how the tax credit program is set up, and that's how it works in every state. It impacts how you allocate money, and that's what I want to sort of focus on as we get through this. You heard Kurt Nacer from PC Construction, I think, also on Friday or last week at some point, talked about how labor shortage, energy code contribute to a 10 to 15%
Yes.
cost increase. This one on the second page, this middle column adjusts for that. So this is just hard cost, right? Total development cost includes land acquisition, architects, all of that. This middle one is just hard cost per unit. And the Vermont figure is reduced by 15%. So this is adjusted for the fact that there's a 15% premium. And this is what we've been doing in the affordable housing world since.
That soft cost is lawyers, engineers, planning. Tell me more about the soft costs.
Everything you can't touch, more or less, right? Like all the building, lumber, everything, we call that hard cost, right? Soft cost is gonna be all the design work, all the legal work, all the financing, insurance.
Imports.
Yep. I mean, we do that ourselves. So, but we have to like hire a civil engineer and all of the engineering and design work.
And the appeals would be in that soft cost piece.
That would be legal. Yeah. And then if you have an interest carry on redevelopment loan, things like that. Yeah. Hard costs is just the physical building. What it like, you strip all that away, you build the building. This is what it is. That's what Kurt was talking about with his estimating. He was talking about, we pay a 15% kind of unavoidable premium in Vermont right now because of the size of our labor force. I say unavoidable, our energy standards, again, a policy trade-off, right? He quantifies that for you. But we're still, once you adjust for that, we're still spending. And that's because we're making some policy choices about what it costs to build, or we're not being particularly competitive, right? Internally, again, being addressed in the next QAP. The result, and I think this is the one, we all get a different number of tax credits, right? We get, I think, $3.3 million worth of tax credits allocated to us every year, but it's over 10 years. So it's really $33 million, right? Maine's got a bigger this is a small state minimum. Maine has a bigger population, it gets more, but when you adjust for the number of units that are being built per $1 million in tax credits, the net result is just that we're not building much. So if you're looking, again, my lens is net new units. And if you're looking over the last 5 years at the tax credit program, we just have not built that many net new units. A lot of good reasons for it, a lot of policy reasons that have resulted in that we can change and are being addressed in the QAP, but sort of an unavoidable statistic, right? That when we dug into those numbers was we knew we were building less. We were surprised it was this dramatic. I did one without it highlighted and paused here to talk about any of these numbers.
Okay, sure.
Well, I mean, because people pay attention to what we say in here, and I want to make sure that I don't scare our perpetually affordable housing community folks who do great work. My one sort of hypothesis I have is that they will often do the projects that don't pencil out. And then we have this flagship, beautiful, historically accurate, they listened to everyone and did everything they were asked project. And we hold that up as though that should be the rule, but it might be the exception, that we let that become our way of saying everything should be done to this level. And that is how we get a situation where people feel like they won the lottery if they get one of these units. And it's just not fair to the very many people who are sleeping in cars or, you know, in motels and don't have housing.
I think again, when you look at this through, like, you zoom out, right, and you say, what are all the policy objectives we're accomplishing? If you push that all to the side, you just say, this is a net new unit moment, right? That's a trade. And we are 100% building fewer units than we should, right?
Yeah.
But we are accomplishing all those, and we've been incentivized to accomplish all those. We're building at nearly 500,000 per unit, right? And we're doing it as efficiently as anybody in this industry, but we have to. Like, the places we're building, the energy standards are above Vermont's already stringent energy standard. I mean, it could be, right? So there are incentives that we have created that are doing this. Again, VHFA has seen that and is addressing it in the next iteration. So I think when we talk about holding up that mirror, I think VHFA understands that and is looking at a net new unit. But you really can't deny that we're really proud of the buildings that we build. I mean, we love our buildings. We would build them more efficiently if we didn't have to compete to have certain characteristics. We build more of them, and we'd be really proud of that too, right? That is the trade-off, and I think that, like, I watched Maura's testimony on Friday, and that was like as earnest as I've seen somebody in our industry be with the, like, what do you want me to do?
Yeah.
Right, in a rising cost environment, do you want us to do these policy goals? Do you want us to build net new units?
I just hope we remember that when
Yes.
we're writing the bill. Like,
Yes.
we really need to remember that when people aren't in the room, reminding us these are the trade-offs.
Right.
Really appreciate that you want to pause to discuss this
Yep.
slide. So one thing I don't want to get lost in the soft costs piece. You said 15% premium, but I just did the quick numbers, and it's really that we're doing about 30% in Vermont of our costs, our soft costs. In our comparable states, they're only spending about 15%. So that's that 15% premium. So we're spending about twice as much in Vermont on soft costs as New Hampshire and Maine.
I can go back and look. So you can take the adjusted hard costs for Maine and New Hampshire, which are not adjusted, right? And compare those to total development cost and understand what is acquisition. There are three categories of costs that go into total development costs: land acquisition, hard costs, soft costs.
My takeaways, the other states have soft costs. We just have twice as many soft costs.
Our green line here on the adjusted hard cost this is our hard cost reduced by 15%. So if it's showing 315, you're not going to make me do math. It's going to be about another $50,000. The actual number is probably closer to 400. So I think the delta on the soft cost side is probably relatively, I mean, it's more here, just like everything, but it's not the main driver. At the end of the day, it all contributes. That's why we should be looking at TDC and not just one of these categories. But hard cost is the one we can adjust for because we have PC's number that if you just took two comparable projects, no other variables, it would cost 15% more here, but we're spending 50% more, right? And so that's where I've tried to isolate what we're doing as an affordable housing world. Yeah. Yep. I think I see where you're going. On the soft cost side, we do have more permitting expenses. We do have all of that because of the regime here.
I guess I'm misunderstanding that because independent of soft costs, I see Vermont is spending on just hard costs, which should be roughly the same, ideally everywhere. I mean, we're all spending roughly the same on lumber, the same on, these all coming from the same places. Land, obviously, is different cost. But are you saying this 37% is then we add the 15% to that so that takes it up to 50, or are you talking
No.
Because I just see it's hard enough to be 37% higher than Maine.
Yeah.
And 31% higher than New Hampshire. But are you saying that's not the total hard cost?
I'm trying to adjust for what we as an affordable housing community can control, right? And that's how competitive we are. That's how what our QAP incentivizes. I'm assuming that we can't control the 15% of total costs that we have in a premium. So I take out 15%, take out Kurt at PC Construction's premium, and say, if we were able to build 15% cheaper, this is what the curve would look like.
This is what the hard costs would be.
And so the hard cost delta you see here are really choices we make, right? And again, I think we're addressing those. For the first,
I guess I thought you were saying that the premium costs are the policy choices we make, not the hard costs. The hard costs strike me as should be sort of similar.
and I think I use policy a little loosely here, right? That 15% might be policy choices you as a legislature can make through workforce development, through our energy code, through things like that. Once you remove that 15%, that's the policy choices we make internally as an affordable housing community through our QAP. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so
Yep. Again, when I prepared these numbers, I prepared these to make a QAP comment, and VHFA has since used this to respond. And we're now
Great.
going to be asked to compete on cost, which I think
it's great.
is great.
I think that's super.
And it's new. It's new for us as a, but I think it goes to like how we are as stewards of your out, right? Which is sort of where I want to shift. If you're all good on this sort of walk through a 3-state survey.
Go for it.
Okay. You saw this slide from Maura, maybe not Friday, but the first time she came in. She was talking about the tools in the toolbox. Everything I just discussed up here relates to that first column. This is the deeply subsidized housing that is the base of it is the LIHTC program, right? That's, I use $500,000 a unit. The more accurate number is maybe a touch higher, $534,000 a unit. There's really no debt on these because they don't cash flow because rents are restricted. That's the whole point. And so it's the LIHTC program and other funding, right? And a big chunk of that other funding is Vermont taxpayer dollars. Some of that other funding is community development block grants from DHCD or other funding that people are able to get. But a big component of it runs through VHCB or VHFA on the sort of out of our general fund. Seen another way, right? That total development cost at around $500,000 a unit, it takes about $250,000, half of that per unit in scarce sources. Sources, once we get a LIHTC award, we're then competing from VHCB, from community development block grant, right? And I'll have a slide at the end that sort of says how that's changed in this inflationary world. We did a project as recently that we opened as 2021, where it was permanent debt and tax credits and some energy incentives, right? But we took no soft costs. There was no taxpayer dollars. There was no VHCB funding. That world completely evaporated with inflation during COVID. ARPA filled that hole. And I think Polly and Gus and Maura presented on how they filled that hole. Maura showed the slide about how the 4%, we were able to do 4% deals because there was a lot of money to throw at them, but we're going to go back to a post ARPA world where 4% deals just don't pencil because the 9% deals don't pencil anymore. The thing I want to talk about how this translates to your all work and this legislative session, knowing that we're in a post ARPA slim appropriation world, right? You have a different challenge this year. You started to have that challenge last year, but then you had 2 years ago. Is, the beauty of this slide is that it goes into some of the middle income programs that VHFA is running, right? And won't join one of my work calls because soft costs are less, because we're not competing under the QAP. There are a lot of reasons why closing one of these deals is cheaper, and they're about $100,000 or less expensive on a total development cost side.
Yeah, but these are substantially less.
We're not paying all the legal fees. We're not having an out-of-state syndicator. And we can be creative and efficient in what we build in the way we can under the low-income housing tax credit program. VHFA has done a year of this. You all have appropriated funding for both of these programs. Middle-income home ownership, we're bringing 37 families through this program in the first phase. And it's, the middle income, she has it here, right? Around 100% of area median income. Those are only taking about 125,000, right? That's her piece up top. 130 to 125K per unit is the subsidy, not the total development cost. That's the subsidy. You have to fully subsidize the LIHTC program, right? Because there's zero debt on that. And so that's a $530,000 project that is subsidized through the low-income housing tax credit program and our soft sources, competitive resources.
Can you pause there? Because one of the things that you and others have helped me better understand over the last year is that similarly to how we had to pull apart affordable for all versus, affordable at a certain
Mhm.
income, permanently affordable is a bit of a misnomer. Because we do our best to make the property permanently affordable to a particular income category, a particular person. But because there isn't a flow of dollars into that unit from anywhere but the state or these, public funding sources, there's not a lot of dollars going into the maintenance of that. And so every 30 or every generation, you need to find the money again to keep that housing affordable. When you first get here, you hear it and you think it's like pennies from heaven, and then all of a sudden this just gets underwritten as permanently affordable, but things depreciate. And so you have to reinvest. And if we are constantly putting the entire reinvestment pot into that, that's a policy choice that we're making. Because if you look at a place like Decker Towers, the rents they charge, they can't even afford security. They can't afford basic upkeep. And we then have to decide, are they on their own, or are we going to put a huge tranche of new public dollars into that project over the decades?
The way I think of it is making something perpetual doesn't cost any more. Making something perpetually affordable doesn't cost anything extra today, right? Like there's no added cost by promising that this will be perpetually affordable versus affordable for 30 years, which is the Treasury low-income housing tax credit requirement of the program, and what most states do. A lot of states will do 50 years. There are a few like us that do perpetual. It doesn't cost anything extra up front, right? But typically these projects need a recapitalization and a major rehab program project somewhere between 20 and 40 years, right? Maybe call it 25 and 35 years. So we're likely going to be reinvesting in them then. And it's a decision, we're making the decision now that 30 years from now, we would rather reinvest to continue the perpetual affordability of that building rather than letting that turn into a more modest 30-year-old market rate building and using those dollars to build a new one. That I don't think there's general consensus on. That's how I think of it. But there's some bargaining power at that 30-year mark, right, by having a perpetual covenant on it. So I think, and I've never really crunched the numbers on it, but that's the way to think about it. It doesn't cost any extra now, but we will need to reinvest in it within the next 30 years, 35 if it's really well maintained, to keep it perpetually affordable. So it's not like set it and forget it.
And for anyone watching, I don't want to say that perpetually affordable housing is not a really critical policy tool in a way that we, keep the lowest income people housed in quality housing. It's just a policy choice that we should understand has a tail, a very long tail.
It does have a tail. It's interesting. It has a different tail than perpetually affordable individual homes, which, many of our members here in the legislature own permanently affordable houses.
You mean shared equity?
Shared equity homes, where they're investing as they go along and investing in continuing the maintenance of the home. It's a very different thing than the apartment buildings that are naturally.
And it's a different income level, kind of like the middle income program.
It is.
You're getting at people who have some capital to put down for down payment and ongoing costs. But when you are housing people who, have very little and will always have very little, the question is, do we spend all of our money there for relatively few units, or do we put some of that money into units that will then truly be self-perpetuating without government reinvestment?
Right. But I think what's realistic is that we need to probably look at how we invest in a recapitalization renovation fund for those exact projects that would,
Kind of like school construction or anything else,
Maybe
where we
like
set it
that.
and forget it, and
So
then
that's-
it's okay.
but for me, for those of us who aren't necessarily experts in this,
Right.
that is clearly a need
Yeah.
we need to address.
And what I'm saying is, yes, absolutely. The moment you say perpetual, that's a problem 30 years from now. It's not an
Right.
issue today.
But
is-
it's an issue today for the buildings that we made perpetually affordable 30 years ago.
We just did a 22 unit rehab of a Section 8 property in Rutland. And you can't get 9% tax credits for rehabs. It's just not a good use of that source. So it's 4%, and it required a lot of soft sources. We just invested a lot of taxpayer dollars, a lot of appropriated dollars into a 4% rehab. Now, that was a Section 8 property, so that was going to be perpetually affordable, but that's just an example of what happens. That was built in the late 80s. You know, we bought it in distress in 2019 from an out-of-state owner. We brought it into, you know, compliance, passing maintenance tests, but it's tired. It needed it, and that's why we bought it. And we were able to do it now, but it took a lot of resources. I mean, that's just an example of understand. I think for all of us understanding how this.
Right, no, this is
Yeah.
very helpful. So we don't yet require in that initial perpetual housing investment, we don't require putting aside an escrow or a capital reserve fund for the 30 years down the line.
The capital reserve fund, this is another piece that makes affordable housing more expensive, and this goes another piece of the soft costs, which is, you know, if you're taking market rents, you're going to be, you know, that becomes a return question about how much you're reinvesting in the building, but you're reinvesting in the building to capture the higher rents you want, right? Like that, the market solves that one. The market doesn't solve that in affordable housing, and so VHFA, VHCB require pretty large reserves. Right. And so that's an upfront cost that you got to populate that reserves with, but it's also a monthly contribution that you could otherwise be paying in debt service. If you have more debt on the building, you wouldn't need taxpayer appropriated dollars to build. Right. And so that, like, it all, affordable housing is a different beast, and it's a complicated thing. Suffice to say, even though we are putting in more money in reserves, it still isn't going to accumulate to a point 30 years from now where you can do a $5 million renovation.
I think that's another conversation we need to have.
Yeah.
Maybe not right now. I don't
Yep.
want to interrupt your presentation too much, but clearly that's a pin we need to figure out.
The takeaway here, and I think Polly and Gus talked about this, is like the amount of money that our investments, that our state investments, our soft source, they're called, right? Investments in the LIHTC program. We have to maximize the LIHTC program. And I think Morris said this. This is like the number one driver of affordable housing nationally. Like, we have to be able to use every tax credit dollar we possibly can. If we want to maximize net new units, we need to figure out how to bring the cost down on those so that our scarce resources are going less to it, and we're able to invest in the myriad other things we need, shelters. But in here, what I'm showing you is what an investment in workforce housing would look like, middle income housing. In Middlebury, as we were talking about requesting the middle income homeownership dollars and then leveraging it, we had a chart and we pitched the Middlebury College Board of Trustees on this with ACCD. There have been, I think, 100 rental units built in the last 10 years in Addison County. And to buy a starter new construction home, you had to make double area median income. The tax credit program is available for people that make less than 60% of area median income. This program, middle income, was originally called Missing Middle, which was the wrong name because that's an urban planning term, not a income bracketing term. But the point remains. I mean, we were demonstrating that in Addison County, you simply cannot afford new construction unless you make over double area median income. And that's what these are solving, right? And this is our workforce is in all types of housing, right? But if you make between 60% of area median income, which you qualify for a tax credit building, or over 200% of area median income, you can afford housing. You still can't in the middle, and there's no support for it, which, to VHFA's credit, is why her tool in the toolbox, Maura's presentation here, is this middle income home ownership program and this middle income rental program, and they're costing 100 to 150 in state subsidies per unit. And so my whole thing is maximize a more efficient LIHTC program. The QAP has taken the first step on that. And then if we're looking at it through a net new unit, take every dollar we can and put it into the middle income programs. Because that's how we're gonna build our way out of it.
And if I could just underscore, I mean, we were criticized over the last year, including by our auditor, for putting money into programs that are not quote unquote perpetually affordable. I liken it to our childcare policy, where we said you can't afford childcare up to 400% of or 500% of the federal poverty line.
575.
So if we only help people at the very lowest income as government, we make it more expensive for everybody else. We just shift that cost to everybody else, like healthcare, like anything. If we don't tackle the full spectrum and accept that some of those will move more toward, market rate eventually, then we have lost the plot entirely, frankly, and we will never get the number of units it would take to have a market that's functional enough to remain affordable for the majority of Vermonters.
Yeah. It's so much that, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
I was just gonna say, so much of that conversation you all had on Friday, I listened because I wanted to hear what everybody said in preparation for this. You heard from Redstone, you heard from others, like it's the workforce, it's the labor force. I mean, this is a vicious cycle, not a virtuous, whatever the opposite is, right? This is a vicious cycle of costs go up, we don't have the workforce, they can't find housing, costs go up more.
So to go to workforce for a second, as you look at these three states, how are they solving their construction workforce issues any better than we are at the moment, given we all have the same declining populations of kids in our high schools and our career and technical education centers? We have added robust support in many ways for our construction. So we certainly need to, anyway, how are they solving this in a way that is more effective than we are at the moment?
I will be a surgeon using a scalpel, right? I'm a housing developer, so I would say they're building more housing.
Yeah. But it's a catch-22, isn't it? They're
Correct.
building more housing because they also have the workforce to do it.
Correct.
So how are they? I guess that's my question is.
And this, I think, is where we hold up the mirror. And I ask everybody to, right? Like everybody looking at Act 250 this year, every DRB member, right? Like everybody that is adding costs to projects, we figure out how we can do it. And then we figure out how we, being you all, sorry, I'm not included, how we appropriate our dollars to build more housing. We can fine tune this, right? There is one structural challenge we have. Their population centers in Maine and New Hampshire are pretty much Metro Boston at this point. We're not. Our population center in Burlington is not. And so they do have that structural advantage. We're never going to get, I don't think we're ever going to get that down to 0, but we might get it down to 10 or, we might get it below 15% and we can make other changes.
Are height limitations a compounding factor to this? Are we struggling in Vermont to allow for taller buildings to achieve some of those densities that we're after?
I will come in and do a whole nother testimony on DRB and all of that. One last piece I just want to show to kind of articulate this.
So I hate to say that, Z, because this is such a great conversation. We do have Kevin Chu ready to go, who has a time challenge today. Would you be kind of just to check with Kevin, if we went to 10 with Z, could he go to 11 and then we could do, that would be great.
Kevin is the one who you want to ask your workforce.
Yes.
stuff.
Yeah.
No,
I won't spend any more energy doing that, and I'll give him that time.
no, but.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
This is my last slide, really. I showed you this graph on the left last year. I literally, when I prepared this PowerPoint, I just took mine from last year and updated it, but I left this one in here. The yellow in this is scarce state resources. These are our last 4 low-income housing tax credit projects, starting in 2018 through what at the time was an application for our Middlebury project, which we've since been awarded. The low-income housing tax credit equity is blue, so just look on the left. The green is permanent debt, and the yellow is everything else. And so the yellow is otherwise scarce resources, partially state, partially federal, right? That's what we're competing for each unit. I added to this the one on the right. The one on the right, blue for a low-income housing, a deeply subsidized program, is the tax credit proceeds. And the yellow is all of the scarce state resources. I call this workforce, we should really be talking about middle income. The blue is going to be what the permanent debt or rental income is, or the sale price to a middle income family. And the yellow is the scarce resource. We can build 2 middle income homes for every tax credit home we can build.
Right.
We have to build every single one of those tax credit build homes. I want to articulate this. I'm not robbing Peter to pay Paul, because we have to leverage that program. We have to figure out how to make that program more efficient, so that any extra dollar you can build 2 units with
Yeah, 2
in a middle income.
Pretty clear.
And again, like the way Maine, New Hampshire control costs, they're using $100,000 less in soft resources for each of those buildings. And in theory, that is 1 middle income unit we could build through BHFA's middle income programs. And so again, I think if we're looking at this purely through a net new units, the policy choices we make as a community matter, and they're more complicated than how I distilled them down today, but these numbers don't really lie, right? And if we're looking at it at a net new units, a little takeaway, right? Maximize the LifeTech program, focus all of our scarce resources for housing into programs that we can do net new units.
Yeah. I just want to thank your students
Yes.
that worked with you as well. I think so often we don't have enough hard numbers, enough hard economics in the economic development committee to have this conversation. We want to live in what's beautiful and what helps one family. And that's important, but I think it's really great for students and young people to learn that beneath the talking points are some really hard realities about how we actually get to housing vulnerable populations, taking care of all Vermonters, having a workforce. So I think your students that worked with you, learned a valuable lesson. I hope they work here. Don't just go back to Texas.
That's my question. Are they staying? No, they're driving to Texas.
We'll see.
But
If we
there's
can
no
keep her.
housing.
I know.
Well, no, but they may be doing a graduate program in Texas.
No, she lives in Texas.
Oh,
That's where
she lives in
came from. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so she already lived. That's
Yeah, it's one. She was a powerhouse. It was incredible. She jumped right in.
great.
We love to keep her.
Great.
I'll
Terrific.
report back.
Zeke, thank you.
Thank you
More to
all.
follow. Thank you. This was
Whatever else you
incredibly
need, let me
helpful.
know. Yep.
And really well illustrated.
Thank you.
Stark challenge.
You should see the background document I have with all this raw data. There are a million more of these charts, and it's so hard to pick the 3 that you feel actually articulate what we're doing and how we're doing it. But glad it helps. Yeah.
Thank you.
Here.
We're great.
So, first question. Yes.
Just 3 more minutes, so we'll give you 4 to 5.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, that's my dog.
Thank you. Zeke, thanks.
Thanks, Ross. Yep.
And once you're ready for the ribbon cutting, we're ready to come and see it as it has evolved.
It's going to be hundreds of families over the next 5 years. So the
Very
first one
exciting.
moving in will do
So
it
how quickly are you going to be able to have the first in?
July. Yep.
We
Modular.
made that happen. Maybe
Yeah,
a
we
year
did.
or 2 earlier.
Quickly on the opportunities, because this was a challenge, but on the plus side, a lot of the things we've put in play have made this happen faster.
Correct. And our hope is that we used a lot of resources to do it, right? Our hope is that this can be a model that we can replicate a little more broadly, and I think that's the hope, is that this will be a way that show how towns work together. That's the theme of my speech, right? Towns working together, legislature putting their money where their mouth is,
College.
everybody, college.
Yes, the college was
Yes.
helpful too.
Yes, not every
They were-
rural
they're-
Vermont town has an employer like that, so.
No,
Yeah.
and they're still involved in this project, or because I know it began with them, but does it continue?
Yeah, and community-wide, there's no saved housing for faculty or students. This is them investing in the community generally. Yeah.
Right,
All right. Kevin knows that too. I'll let him take over.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.
Kevin, welcome. Come join us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you. I am not sure you know all of us because we have 2 new members of our committee. So I'm just going to have us introduce ourselves.
Yes, we know each other. You track stuff. You just track the kids and done it really well, as well as many other things.
Oh, nice. So you have Keisha, Allison Clarkson, Windsor District.
Randy Franklin. Randy.
Morning, Dave Leaks, Roman County.
Great. Take it away. Thanks.
Excellent. My computer's being a little slow to wake up here, so I'm trying to connect to the Zoom. And I'll pull up a presentation, but before I do, I have some printed copies of the Economic Action Plan that was recently released last week. If you'd like one, I can give you one, but it looks like you may have copies in front of you already.
Yes, and somehow the House got copies, but the Senate did or didn't. So I didn't get one in my mailbox yesterday, but
It's there
procured
today.
one.
It's there today.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, and they are mailboxes, and I just muted myself there.
Yes, and Heidi's made it a copy for all of us.
Excellent. Well, while my slides load, I can introduce who I am and the work of the Futures Project and why you have a copy of an economic action plan in front of you. So my name is Kevin Chu. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Futures Project. The Futures Project is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization focused on economic research and education. So this economic action plan is the culmination of about 2 years of work that involves quantitative analysis of the data, and there's plenty in the plan, and also qualitative research, engaging with Vermonters. I had the privilege of speaking with over 5,000 Vermonters over the past 2 years, lots of public presentations. And it was not only to share data, but also to collect input and listen to the hopes, dreams, and ambitions of Vermonters to understand what are their challenges today and what are their hopes for the future. What is the Vermont that they might want to leave behind to their kids or grandkids? So that is all embedded into this plan. And the frameworks within it are that Vermont's future depends on people and places. To add a little bit more detail to that, specifically demographics and housing scarcity are the driving challenges. We hear about the symptoms from those root causes. We hear about the workforce challenges. We hear about the housing crisis. We hear about the cost of healthcare and education, the affordability challenges. Again, these are all symptoms, and it comes back to demographics and housing scarcity. So I think these slides are finally loaded. I will queue them up. And we'll go through a little bit of detail on the underlying data, as well as an overview of the recommendations that you'll find in the plan itself.
I love this dedication to your parents.
Thank you for noticing that.
You've mentioned them before. It's lovely.
That is what inspires me to do this work. So my parents immigrated from Southeast China back in 1986 to Vermont, of all places. I'm very lucky and thankful that they ended up here because they found a community of folks who wanted to help them succeed. It was a time when there were new Americans coming from all over the world that have contributed to the economic vitality of Vermont. And neither of my parents spoke English, neither of them had a college degree, but they were still able to find economic opportunity. They were able to find gainful employment. They put 3 boys through college. They were able to purchase a home and realize their American dream. So my personal commitment to this work is to make sure other people have the same opportunity, not only today, but moving forward into the future as well. And that's all driven by this mission section of the Futures Project, which is how can we use data to support the evolution of Vermont's economy toward the thriving future full of opportunity for all. I mentioned my travels around the state. These are some of the themes that emerged during public engagement. Again, none of these words or phrases will come as a surprise to you all. But I wanted to ground our research and ground the data in the realities that Vermonters are voicing on a day-to-day basis. The Economic Action Plan sets some aspirational long-term targets. I mentioned the people and places framework. So within each, you'll find sets of strategies that are categorized into expansion strategies or efficiency strategies. For the people framework of growing the working age population, we set a target of 802,000 by 2035. That's informed by a workforce gap analysis, which I'll show you in just a sec. And certainly efficiency, how do we do more with what we have? How do we increase labor force participation? Same thing with the places framework. we need to be able to better utilize the resources we already have in our community, make it easier to tap into some of those resources. And then at the same time, expansion, building more units actually allows efficiency to happen simultaneously. And back to this idea of connecting the dots. So symptoms versus root causes. We're going to focus on the people framework first, and I'll share some data to frame that, and then we'll shift to the places framework. So when we look at the age distribution of Vermont in the year 2000, it's a very different picture than where we are today. In the year 2000, we had a large working age population relative to the number of children and elderly. So that was about 226,000 Vermonters between the ages of 25 to 49, 25 years ago. And there were about 77,000 Vermonters 65 plus. Now, when we take a look at how that compares to where we are now, it's a very different picture today. So the number of 25 to 49-year-olds has decreased by a little over 30,000, while the number of 65 plus Vermonters has almost doubled. Right, so our potential workforce is shrinking. That means our tax base is also shrinking. And as the population ages, generally healthcare needs go up. And if folks are leaving the workforce, they still have housing needs. Their housing needs are likely different than they were 20, 30 years ago. And Vermont has the lowest fertility rate of any state in the country, which means our homegrown talent supply is shrinking.
Is this the baby boom wave, or is this more amplified in Vermont in your perspective?
It's both. It's more amplified in Vermont because Vermont is one of the oldest states by median age, which means Vermont actually is on the leading edge of the demographic implications of the labor force implications of demographics. And I'll get into more detail about that. So the way we go from demographics to labor force, if we take a look at the ratio of
but also just gotta just put a pin into what Tom said, which is I also think not only are we aging out of the active workforce, but we also, at least in my community, if you tracked who's moving to Vermont, huge number of retired people moving to Vermont full time, huge. And we don't necessarily keep track of that, but I mean, tax department, somebody, I mean, I don't know who tracks the profile of who's moving to Vermont, but I assume
I can share some follow-up data from the Census Bureau that breaks down who has moved in by which age categories. It's not in this presentation, but I do have that data.
Yeah, and sadly, the last census is 2020, and I know they do some updates, but that's behind already.
We're halfway to the next one. There are yearly estimates through the American Community Survey, which is how we get get an idea of what's happening on the ground between the decennial census. So going back to the interplay between demographics and labor force, over the past decade, we've seen a dramatic shift in the ratio of job seekers and job openings. So a decade ago, there were about 2 job seekers for every 1 open job in Vermont. There were more people looking for work than work available. And today that ratio is inverted. So for every 1 job seeker, there's about 2 open jobs. That's the workforce shortage. So that's a look back over the past decade. A look forward to the next decade. This is what underlies the 802,000 long-term target. This is a workforce supply and demand gap analysis to try to understand how many people are coming into the workforce each year versus how many people are exiting the workforce. And what we find is that the largest driver of workforce demand, so people leaving the workforce, is retirements. The Vermont Department of Labor projects about 17,150 retirements annually through 2032. How do we close that gap? We can try to retain more of our high school grads, but that number is dwindling each year. We can try to retain more college grads, but even if we increase retention to near 100% for high school and college grads, we would still need some level of net migration into Vermont to really close that gap long term. So this number projected out to 2035, 2040, this is what informs our long-term population target. I didn't pick it just because the area code.
Although it is.
Yeah, you did.
So now when we take a look at labor force and population together, I think this really helps us understand the situation we're in and also the strategies for what we do about it. I mentioned efficiency and expansion. Efficiency in terms of labor force means how do we get more people who are here and not participating back into the labor force? So the labor force is the green line on this chart. The population by age cohorts is the blue bar, right? So you can only grow the green up to where the blue is, which means efficiency alone, again, is not enough. And we also need expansion. We need to be able to increase the working age population. In the economic plan, you'll find strategies for expansion. We see this document as a robust starting point to continue thinking about ways that we can attract more people to Vermont. This is
Randy's favorite line.
again, an overview of some of the strategies. We need to be able to tell Vermont's story to other people to get them interested. We also need to be able to tell a better story within the state that's in reach and help to educate communities about the benefits of growth and how more working age people can improve affordability for people who are already here. So again, this is just a list of the types of strategies that we have added, and in the plan itself that goes into more detail, along with data to support each of the recommendations.
Before you leave this slide, have you taken into account the increased pressure on remote workers to go back to work? Because other than a lot of retireds and early retireds moving to Vermont, we also in COVID, as you know, had just a big influx of people who were able to work remotely. And many of those jobs are being called back to work. And so have you any beginning data on that trend?
Yes, so in the plan, you'll see for the remote work recommendation, there's benchmark data from prior to the pandemic, and then it shows yearly data for 21, 22, and 23. And there is a decline in the rate of remote work over those years. That's part of the return to office movement. But the number of remote workers nationally still remains very elevated compared to pre-pandemic, more than double what it was before COVID. I think we're still, as a society, trying to figure out what that equilibrium is in terms of hybrid, remote, in-person. But the data show that about 22.5 million people across the country are working remotely right now. And if we can tap into just a small fraction of that, it could be a strategy to help grow the working age population and grow the tax base in Vermont.
Right.
In terms of efficiency strategies, we take a look at the alignment between education and employment to make sure that the training that's offered in our communities match with the labor market opportunities, not only of today, but what we may anticipate in the future. Again, the Vermont Department of Labor has been a very helpful source of data in this analysis. We also know that there are about 71,000 Vermonters between the ages of 16 to 64 who are not employed and not seeking employment. So part of the recommendations is addressing barriers that may be preventing folks from finding employment or keeping employment. We also need to grow the number of opportunities that may attract and retain talent by strengthening the business climate as well. So these are all efficiency strategies. These are things that we can do with what we already have here. So we'll shift to the places framework to connect the dots there as well.
Sorry, I'm just trying to follow along in this document. So expansion strategies 1 and 2 are efficiencies in here. I guess I'm just not seeing them quickly.
Expansion strategies are all clustered together and focused on.
Got it. And then the
growing
efficiencies are
population.
following.
That's right.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the format for both the people and places framework.
Great, David.
So I'm curious, first off, great presentation. You're the first guy in my 2+ years here that's talked about making a distinction between symptoms and root causes. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
Thankfully, finally. But I'm going to challenge you on root causes. So I'll give you an example, Rutland County. Used to have a population, let's call it 26,000 roughly. Now it's got a population of 18,000. The same houses are there, plus some new. Is there really housing scarcity as one of the major drivers as a root cause for our demographic problem, our economic problem?
The demographics and housing scarcity are intertwined, and I'll get into that in
Okay.
this next bit of data. So this is a distribution of the housing units by the year that the structures were built. Vermont has some of the oldest housing stock in the country. About a quarter of the homes were built before 1940. And then you can see we built at a relatively healthy rate in the 70s and 80s. That was a time when there was population growth in Vermont, but over the course of the last 55 years, we've seen a new housing construction go in the other direction. It's been slowing down to the point where less than 20% of Vermont's housing stock has been built in the last 20 years. So the family size, the median household size in the 70s and 80s was different than what we see now. One of the predictable dynamics with an aging population is generally household size goes down, right? So if you had a family of four, let's say in the 80s, and it was 2 adults, 2 kids, they may have purchased a 4-bedroom home. Now the kids have grown up, they've moved out. They might not have stayed in Vermont because we didn't build enough new homes. So you'll have fewer people occupying a home that still has a lot of bedrooms. And what that means is the housing stock that we have might not be efficiently utilized to its fullest extent. And that was something that we looked into with our research on latent capacity. And you'll find this in the plan itself. And this is a demonstration of how efficiency and expansion have to work together. So our latent capacity research, to your point, shows that many towns across the state have fewer people today than they did at one point in the history. And Rutland certainly stands out here, but this is a phenomenon all over the state.
Latent capacity, I mean, lost population.
It's a calculation between the historical peak population of a place versus the current population.
So what, I mean,
So
Like-
if a town used to have 5,000 people and they have 2,500 today, then the latent capacity is calculated as 2,500.
so help me see this with Rutland, because we were just on Rutland. So
Yeah.
let's talk about that 13,000.
Yeah, so all the areas that are blue and green on this map have fewer people today than they did at one point in their past.
So your lens is tracked with what this is experiencing
Right.
with mine. In South Burlington, we are bursting at the seams because people are just are moving.
That's right.
And you need housing.
Yeah, so the areas that are the lighter shade on this map are places that have experienced growth. They're at population peaks, right? So a latent capacity of 0 doesn't mean a community doesn't have capacity for growth. It just means it's at a historical peak population. But if you were to just say, if you were to say, let's restore every town in Vermont back to its historical peak, we would have over 71,000 Vermonters, right? And so population growth in the aggregate at the state level is also a rural revitalization strategy. And if we were just to restore towns back to their historical peak, that would get us almost halfway to that 802,000 long-term target. What's captured in this latent capacity concept is that idea of empty bedrooms, right? Because the population has changed, the needs of the population has changed as it's aged. We need to be able to create the housing stock, the types of housing that fit the needs of our population now. So if you have, let's say, an older Vermonter occupying a home larger than their current needs, the only way we free up that latent capacity is if they have an option for something to move into, if they can downsize, and then that way it creates space for a growing family to move in. Does that address the question?
You're getting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah.
I'm listening.
The churn,
This is
I mean, we
great.
really have no churn capacity.
There isn't enough healthy mobility to tap into the existing
Exactly.
stock that we have.
Right.
I have to comment that transportation fits very squarely in this. As I think about 89 coming through White River Junction up through Burlington, through St. Albans and 91, that's where people, because they see the convenience. And I only see that going further as automobile traffic sadly to get more and more convenient as it's more autonomous. So I would also argue our friends over in transportation need to see expanded ease of access through Rutland City with
Yeah, we got
2-lane highways is a way to grow through the state. Is that part of your analysis?
In the places framework, we not only talk about housing, but we also talk about all the things around housing that really make a community, that make a place, and enable housing expansion to happen effectively as well. And that includes things like water, wastewater, energy, digital connectivity, and also smart growth.
But to go to Thomas's point, 91 should look awful.
It's
I mean, and it's not.
it's
I mean, if you look at that map, 91, that same down in Brattleboro, yes, but not for the whole stretch of 91, which goes right out.
If I'm not mistaken, 91 does go up here. So what we're not seeing is that displacement, whereas this is kind of a transportation desert. Think of Route 7.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. But
Yeah. So data is helpful insofar that it can tell us
latent capacity.
where we've been, how we got here, and it can be the basis of
And our
making better
opportunities for growth.
decisions for moving
But
forward.
even if you see the eastern side of the state, although 91 goes up towards Newport, you also have on the other side of the Connecticut River, you've got an Interstate 93 that's going up that presumably should not make that as blue as it is.
Well, 93 hits pretty high up there.
Well, it does.
Just maybe to focalize on Senator Weeks' point, I just think Rutland.
Yeah, no,
Rutland is
I
obvious,
think
yeah.
Rutland stands out. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Tom.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's great, a great line of inquiry, because when we think about why an individual or family may choose to relocate either to or from Vermont, it's often a variety of factors. And I think transportation can be part of the puzzle that helps to connect people to economic opportunity, to connect them to resources like hospitals and schools. So we can't think about housing in isolation, right? We have to also think about the broader conditions that make Vermont either an attractive place or somewhere where younger people have traditionally been moving away from. And I'd much rather see it as a place of growth, of opportunity that attracts people here.
If I could.
Yeah.
In Rutland County, which is what I have this highlight here, we have roughly 2,200 units offline. How do you explain that when we're in the middle of a housing crisis? So we've got housing stock that's just, it's dormant.
The correlation of jobs,
I can see.
where the jobs are available and where the housing is available are not always in sync.
But Kevin's the data guy. I'm really looking to, like,
Yeah.
is there what's the root cause there for, okay, economic slowdown, wage slow after, it's been 70, 80 years since Rutland had a boom.
Yeah.
Got all these units offline, can't motivate developers to put them back online. So really, what's the root cause? I mean, I'm going back to your root cause, which I really appreciate your opinion on.
Yeah, so we would have to look at the condition of those vacant units. As I mentioned, latent capacity, some of that might capture empty bedrooms in a unit that's occupied. That's very different than a unit that is completely vacant. In the recommendations of the economic plan, it does look at programs like VHIP to help bring underutilized stock back to the market that may not be in a condition that's fit for occupation right now. But there's also a map, and I can point your attention to it with a specific page number that looks at a ratio of jobs to homes. It's on page 39.
And I can't find your latent capacity one in here, but. Okay.
I'll make sure that you have these slides as well. I'll send them to
Yeah.
you.
No, it's great.
So the distribution of jobs to homes adds another data layer to this complex multivariable conversation, right? It shows where there are clusters of jobs, of economic opportunities that have fewer homes available in those communities. That's the darker blue. And then that means what happens is people are driving on a regular basis to access those economic opportunities. On the flip side, there are also places around the state where there are a lot of homes and fewer jobs, which means if we can bring opportunity closer to where people already live, it can also reduce that transportation burden.
And there's, and the environmental impact.
That's right. And that's why we included it in the smart growth section of this plan, which is showing that development and economic growth can be complementary to environmental progress and sustainability. And there's even a chart here from the Energy Action Network that shows Agency of Transportation Research modeling out different styles of growth. If we see dispersed growth, more people, more homes could increase Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions. However, in a smart growth scenario, more homes, more people can actually drive down the greenhouse gas emissions because it reduces vehicle miles traveled. And high growth actually reduces emissions by more. So it's
Right.
not a question of can it be more sustainable? It's more a question of how do we pursue it? And it's not the economy versus the environment. We can do both.
No, we can do both. That's good. Great. Yeah, but Rutland faces in some of the same, Rutland City in particular faces many of the same issues we face in Springfield, Vermont, which is the jobs are not necessarily where the fabulous housing is.
Yeah, so when there's a disconnect, people are driving.
Everyone I met in Middlebury at that housing event, people who worked at the college, people who were part of the project, all lived in Chittenden County in South Burlington and commuted down to Middlebury. They were more excited than anybody from a personal perspective that this housing was being built.
Yeah, Middlebury College and Porter Hospital, some of their employees even drive from New York State because they can't find housing.
They said 20% of Middlebury employees live in New York State.
Of the college.
Driving out, like,
Crown Point Bridge.
Yeah, over the bridge. That's why when the bridge was closed, it was such a challenge.
That's right. So again, to tap into some of this latent capacity, we have to have expansion, right, to bring mobility, healthy mobility back to the housing market, whether it's in the ownership market or even the rental market. Vacancy rates are at historic lows, which means that we aren't effectively utilizing what we already have. This long-term target of the 350,000 total non-seasonal housing units by 2035, it's the same rate as you see in the statewide housing needs assessment. And I know there are a variety of housing numbers that are floating around out there, different numbers by different years. But when I take a look at all of them together, the rate is the same across all those numbers that you're seeing. But we can't wait until the year 2032 or 2033 to start making a move on this long-term target. There has to be intermediate progress along the way, incremental progress. So the statewide housing needs assessment that was released last year estimated that Vermont needs about 24,000 to 36,000 new primary homes over the next 5 years. I'm focusing on the 36,000 number here because it captures the rate of growth post-pandemic as well. I think that we have to be able to set the bar high in terms of these aspirational goals, because if we go back to pre-pandemic levels of growth, we're not getting out of housing shortage. We're not going to address the workforce gap. But the analysis breaks down exactly what goes into that 36,000. So some of it is to replace lost homes. We have very old housing stock. Some of it goes offline, is decommissioned each year. Some of it's lost to natural processes like flooding. Definitely took out some housing stock in Vermont. Some of the new homes we need is to address homelessness, normalizing vacancy rates, and then to meet the both pre-pandemic and post-pandemic demand. I think what's important to focus on is the annual rate, right? So
The annual budget.
annual rate to get to 36,000, what would we need to build on a yearly basis over the next 5 years? So we would need in the 7,000 to 8,000 range per year, I think 7,200 to be exact. And to do that, right, we need to create conditions, whether it's policies, regulations, even culture, that support and allow for that growth to happen. This is also where data is helpful. It can keep score. How are we doing? We're not doing well enough to meet that stated need. We permit about 2,500 units per year. That's how many are allowed. While at the same time, the statewide housing needs assessment says we need 36,000 over 5 years. We need over 7,000 per year. And we only allow 2,500 per year.
Well, is that including the green light we've given for interim measures for development?
This is data through 2023.
Okay.
So I don't,
But we also heard yesterday that was 1,600 units. That's nowhere near where we need to be.
Well, from one source of a certain scale.
The jurisdictional
Yeah, that-
opinions,
right.
which is,
Exactly.
I don't know where, even if it's lower scale, you're not getting more than 400 units out of
Yeah.
lower scale projects.
Yes, Jane.
Going back one slide, where is there like a map of where those units are needed as opposed to just being a statewide number?
I think there is regional analysis in the statewide housing needs assessment. I don't have it in front of me, but I can certainly follow up and share that because I'm quite sure there's at least a county level breakdown.
Do you, so the planners yesterday brought us, if everyone, it's good to probe what they brought us, because what I think it was by population generally and capacity, if they grew their population to what would create a healthy vacancy rate. So that's where they got
I get
the
that.
$500 for Middlebury.
Yeah.
But are you saying where are they needed from a
Or are they all in
perspective?
Chittenden County?
We'll
No,
take some.
No.
I mean, so
Well,
our
but yesterday they
population's
showed
declining.
They showed us
Yeah.
by county.
Yeah, I know, I was.
I know,
Oh, that's right. Okay.
but
I did read,
when
read the
you,
packages, I didn't see that.
when you see the presentation, they did it by RPC district.
Okay.
So they have assigned numbers for each district, and that will be kind of an assigned per town.
Okay, so I have heard some of that buzz locally, okay, but our population's still flat, our economy is on change, no change in transportation.
This is Rutland.
It's Rutland specific, right? I'm wondering where they got, I think it's 7,000 units. 7,000 units for what? You know, where's the growth? That's what I'm not
We had
convinced
that
yet.
conversation.
Okay. And I've had that conversation with, you know, our regional developmental folks, and I'm just not sure. I understand we need housing. I get it, but there are other problems which are affecting
Yeah.
our economic malaise.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering where where this big number, 35,000 plus, where they are, because they're not in my count. And
But actually, there are some that are hoped for in your county too.
but I don't get that math either. That's the point. That's what I'm pushing back on, because I'm not convinced that we need, again, our number in our county was 7,000 units over the next 5-10 years. So
So, I mean, when I did a lot of work in Rutland, doing work around the state on, economic and environmental policy, the problem I saw in Rutland, I mean, and I think we should dig into this, was rural senior isolation, which is what I think I walked in on, is that you have a lot of older folks who have large historic homes. And I mean, one woman I remember at the library said her neighbor died and nobody knew for a week because nobody went to check on her, So, I mean, I think each county has a different housing problem, but a housing problem nonetheless. And I think in Rutland, it seems to me it's the type of units and the condition of the units, not if Rutland needs 6,000 new units, new probably means half of them are bringing those
Units back on.
empty ones back
I agree with
into.
that.
Yeah, so I guess it's not.
But again, at the same time, the economy's flat. So what's the need for the growth? That's my fundamental problem.
Mhm.
Nothing's changed in the county.
I think what I think you're flirting with is we need more economic opportunity in Rutland, and maybe we need a new IBM or a new beta. We need to, as a state, welcome and invite something bigger
Right.
for Rutland to fill the capacity and
Well, one of the data visualizations, first of all, this Venn diagram is my new favorite Venn diagram that I have ever seen. I will be like, you need to come to all my select board meetings. But one of the visualizations we looked at in the last couple of years was the commuting patterns in Vermont. That probably still for your hospital, for anything happening in your community, people are for some reason feeling like they don't have the choice to live in Rutland and live in the kind of housing that they need. So they are commuting. I mean, we are seeing patterns where the major population centers like Rutland, you can visualize the commuting routes, which is why we have such a climate emissions problem related to commuting. So I think I would love to dig into why is Rutland having this unique challenge, because every community, like Stowe has a different problem than Rutland. They both have a housing crisis.
But Springfield has the same problem that Rutland has. I mean, so I think that is a piece of what we have to be addressing is our economic development is in addition. But right now anyway, we're focused on housing now, but the intersection of those two are.
Yeah. And I think that is exactly the right conversation to have, which is how do we think about growth in totality?
Exactly.
Not only of homes, but also of economic opportunity.
Yeah.
And that is definitely a guiding principle in this plan.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Rutland has one of the best CTE centers in the state. It also has some great opportunities for building modular homes and modular units for housing in Fairhaven. There are a bunch of things we need to just be moving on that aren't happening at this very moment. That, I mean, there's.
Let's do a Rutland field trip.
This sentiment is a good segue into wrapping up the presentation, and then we can just continue the discussion that we're already having. So this plan is really about taking a look at the conditions in Vermont based on data, right? Because that tells us how we got to where we are. But data isn't destiny. And if we don't like where the trend lines are going, we can make different decisions as a state to get off of those trend lines. And so this plan puts us on a path towards affordability and abundance. I'm going to reframe the long-term targets just by talking about that per year rate. If Vermont grows its population and grows its housing stock by just 2% annually each year through 2035, we hit those targets. That's a very different conversation, especially at the local level, right? If you live in a town of 1,000 people, that's how do you welcome 20 new residents to your community next spring?
Exactly. Making it bite size. And I think that's what Catherine did yesterday, which was, I think that was helpful for some of us. And what Keisha talked about, it's a middle grade project, making it, oh God, we can do that. 20 people a year.
Exactly.
Making it possible.
So the Futures Project isn't telling communities what to do, where to build, how to do it. It's about establishing what these long-term targets are based on that underlying workforce gap analysis. Here's how many people we need. Here's how many houses we need. But it's also to empower local champions to lead that, to say, what is the type of growth that's needed in our community to meet our needs? The types of housing that's needed in Rutland is going to be very different than Chittenden County. It's going to be very different than the Northeast Kingdom. And the community should be able to define that. But in aggregate, all those numbers should add up to these statewide targets.
I'd like to propose that Megan help us with a field trip to Rutland and to Killington. I mean, like, that's going to
It's
be
two different worlds.
right. But I mean, if we're all going down there, that shouldn't be two different worlds, right? They're about to have a massive job growth, and
that chap is
probably Rutland would be a ideal place to bring 2,200 units back online for people to live. So, that corridor, I think, is something that we should understand. And I would like to go on that field trip. So I'll be going and asking.
Okay. So let's talk about field trips at another point, but let's finish with you and your charge to us.
Yeah, no, I'll wrap up with the
Venn diagram.
This is
Yeah.
This
Right,
is it.
because
This
I
is
think-
my line.
This is how we have a solution seeking conversation. We acknowledge where we are, and then we define a vision for where we want to go. And then we start selecting tactics for how we get there based on the direction we want to take. Do we want to take a scarcity pathway, or do we want to take an abundance pathway? This plan is geared towards abundance and affordability.
Did you create this? Because you should trademark it and This is like the country right now, I feel like.
Yeah, so I leave you with this. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kevin. This is terrific.
Do we have a minute or two?
Absolutely.
So in your data collection and the population problems that you were expressing earlier, are you able to break it down to like what trade on this? Like,
Yeah.
you know, to give us a sense that to help us with another conversation and with CTEs and such.
Yeah.
That it's plumbers, it's, you know, can you quantify any of that? You know, given, you know, expected retirements.
Yeah.
What's, you know, the path that's coming out of CTEs, the natural migration of folks into or out of Vermont.
I mentioned the Vermont Department of Labor long-term occupational projections earlier, which is where the retirements number comes from. That analysis does an occupation by occupation assessment based on expected retirements, job openings, job growth or decline. So that data is available down to the occupation level. I can again follow up and send you that spreadsheet.
That and where the houses are anticipated, those 35,000 plus houses are anticipated the need.
Sure,
That would be very.
I can do that for you.
Since we have time.
Now, Kevin is time limited. So Kevin, you have to leave at 10:45?
Mhm.
Okay, right.
I just want to connect it back. I know transportation is not the only answer, but I will say I-89
Please.
I-89 has not had a new exit added to it since it was built in the 1970s. And I would wonder if we might also achieve some of our goals by looking at, for example, in my district, Bolton is a ski resort that you have to go up 20 or 10 miles to get to it, which is terribly inefficient. But if we as a state recognize that adding an interstate exit there would change the calculus for
Well, that's being
developers.
built.
I'd love to hear that. That's a conversation I think we should be
I
having.
thought that was in the-
My point is, if we as a state commit down that path to put then all of a sudden developers, people line up to the properties that it will be development and growth. And I know there's a contingent out there that don't want to see that area by Bolton to be grown. I just think the same lens can be applied to Rutland. I'd love to see expanded transportation alleyways so that we can
Employment
corridors. So I think transportation is something we have a lot of control over in this building that we could use to grow economies in various areas, including Rutland.
And I mean, part of my senior thesis 20 years ago was how Rutland didn't have sidewalks in a lot of places that families want to live. I mean, you know, it's a everything transportation solution. People want to have a walkable community, and
And a
Rutland, I feel
bikeable.
like, has been the poster child for what's possible if we drive resources there.
Right. Exactly. And Thomas, to go to your point, at intersections, which are our natural junctions now, like White River Junction was with the trains, and former transportation hub, and therefore growth hub, we have not enabled or approved development at, I think Exit 4 is our best example of, we're now doing this huge childcare which is having its challenges there. But I mean, there were housing and hotel proposals there, none of which ended up flying, all of which in many ways, had they been done well, would have been a great addition at that hub, at that intersection. So it's,
But you said in this speech, and I've seen you present before, you always do such a great job. It is about culture. And what I'm seeing is a shift of people starting to see growth as an answer. And maybe for the last prior 20 or 30 years, that was more, people were more reluctant, but not everybody wants growth. And so it's a balancing act, and that's.
or growth where. And I think growth where has been the challenge. And that is why, for example, growth at the exit hubs has not been, and I am part of this because they're competing goods between growth and housing that we need, and also supporting our downtowns and village centers and driving that growth into downtown Randolph rather than having it out of the exit.
For the record,
that's
Tom's
been-
right about the exit. I just texted my friend who's the CEO of Milton.
I'm pro-growth for Vermont. I don't see this state as a nature preserve. It's not what it's meant to be. And so I want to see more opportunity.
A gated community.
It is not a
I
gated.
like.
They're not mutually exclusive.
Correct.
I don't think they
It's
need
always
to be
important
pitted.
to-
And our job is to be able to balance competing goods. That is what we do as
Important
legislators.
to ask
every day.
preservation of what and for whom.
Let me answer a question if I can regarding the report. It's been out for a while now, but widely circulated, you've gone around the state. What resistance do you have? What disagreement do you have with any of the comments or thoughts in the report, if any? Is anybody objecting?
Certainly, yeah.
What kinds of
I would be
objections
doing
are you having?
When did
I
this,
know you.
Yeah,
Kevin, when was this published?
this was officially published last Tuesday.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
The
Yeah, brand
ideas
new.
have been circulating in my presentations and been part of a public discourse, and there has been some disagreement. There are some Vermonters that actually want to see the population go down. They think we're beyond a sustainable capacity. Again, I think we can analyze that through a data-informed lens. One of the phrases I've heard in pushback is Vermont is beyond its carrying capacity. And I think the latent capacity analysis shows we can't make that as a blanket statement across the state because there are clearly many communities that have existing capacity for growth. I think that this Venn diagram is a great way to start focusing more on solutions versus scapegoats. I think that I have encountered Vermonters that have said to me, I want to maintain low population density and I'm okay paying higher taxes. And to me, at least they've picked a spot on this diagram that is not in the middle. I've also talked to some Vermonters that say, I think we do too much in terms of services and programs. I'd rather achieve lower cost of living by going down the scarcity pathway. Like,
Right. But they're okay paying higher taxes, but they also want to see someone at the hospital within a few months. They also want someone to plow their driveway.
they want to
So
be in the middle.
they want
They
to
want-
be in the middle.
Exactly.
Because you can't even just pay for ample services anymore if you're in the crisis business.
For the service they consider
Well,
basic.
I'm not interested
Yeah,
so much or asking so much about which opinions are right or wrong. Or sound or unsound. I'm just asking about what you're hearing and what kind of reaction.
So that's some of what I'm hearing. In aggregate, most people I speak with agree with the abundance pathway. Some of the other pushback I get, and it's interesting for me to hear this because my background is actually in environmental studies. Some of the pushback is growth is going to decrease our sustainability. It's going to move us farther off track of hitting some of our climate goals. And again, the data I included in the smart growth section shows that it can be complementary if done in a certain way. So those ecological concerns, I totally get it. And I think it allows us to then have a more nuanced conversation, but to create this false dichotomy of economy versus the environment doesn't help anyone.
No, and it is a false thing.
Are you available to go to select board meetings to have this conversation?
He's already.
We can have a follow-up about that.
Can I book you?
I think maybe
My
a
my
regional.
time is limited and
A
a
regional
tight
meeting.
hand, but we can
Yeah.
chat.
Yeah, right.
He's not amenable to work.
Right. In evenings at 8:30.
Disciples go up.
Right, right. And how are you working with our RDCs to look at the economic development growth opportunities and beginning to explore what types of economic development opportunities would be? I mean, we have lots of space. How do we also interlace this conversation with the commercial space we have available that's empty at the moment?
Yeah.
With the fabulous buildings that we have in Springfield and in Rutland that are not fully utilized now and could be for economic development. Where is that? How are we beginning that analysis of where we could grow and what kinds of things, given the resources that we have in our communities, like an outstanding CTE centers, and who's having,
Yeah.
how are we moving that conversation forward?
I think that's a really exciting next phase
Yeah, so
for
that's the phase I think
for
David and I.
this type of work. And the RDCs were wonderful collaborative partners in helping to develop this. So I'll highlight just on page, I believe 2 and 3, the list of partners, extensive list of partners
Yes, it's just,
that
it's
helped to put together the ideas in this plan. I certainly don't claim that all these ideas were original Kevin Chu thoughts. I've served as an aggregator and a translator. A lot of smart people and smart organizations have contributed to the creation of this plan. I just had the privilege of putting it together in a package that kind of looks pretty.
Should be on the cover.
That's the debate, scarcity pathway.
Yeah, and I think that's why I say it's a next phase of work, because it was important to take a step in establishing which direction we want to go based on where we are now. And if we can create consensus of pursuing an abundance pathway, then I think communities will be more open to those conversations of economic development at the local level.
What are your next steps at this point?
So next steps in terms of this launch, I will be traveling back to the communities that helped me put this together to bring these ideas out, to empower partners to be able to lead data-informed conversations at the local level. There will also be a digital communications campaign as well, because I know not everyone has the flexibility and freedom to show up to an in-person engagement. There will also be more regional analysis. So a lot of the data in this plan is aggregated at the state level, because if I tried to include the regional one, it would have been maybe 10 times as thick, right? But that doesn't mean that work isn't important. It just means it's something that I'm going to get to. So there are a lot of exciting opportunities. Again, launching a plan to me is the starting point, not the end. If it's just a report that sit on shelves, we haven't created impact. So I'm really excited about what comes next.
So I have a question for you. If you have challenges for us as policymakers on page 47, how can you help, to go to Randy's question? And implement bold long-term policies for workforce housing growth. We've heard. Where I would love to have a conversation with you and this committee about, given the workforce opportunities we have, I mean, what would be your top suggestions for us on, let's say, one workforce area, construction workforce? We've invested a lot in our construction work. We need to invest more, obviously. We've worked really hard to reduce stigma. We've really worked hard to, we still haven't figured out how to make the financing work between regular high school and CT centers. But what would you be suggesting for us for action on that?
Yeah, well, I want to take a step back from that comment about construction workforce and just remind us to think about workforce in general, because the occupation that someone holds today might be different in 2 years or 5 years, and careers evolve, which is why
I think that's true for everyone around this table.
Yeah, that's why the Futures Project felt it was important to establish what is the overall workforce gap, right? And when we talk about workforce, we're talking about people, dynamic people who can shift from one occupation to another as their career evolves. So someone who might enter into construction or the trades could be working in healthcare in 5 years. But unless we balance the total number of people versus the total number of jobs, there will continue to be a workforce shortage regardless of which industry we focus on. So I think that is an important thing to remember in terms of how we pursue solutions is, are we taking steps to balance that equation, or are we just shifting people around without actually closing the gap?
Okay, and then I know Kevin has to go.
I mean, what I think is really brilliant and valuable about this Venn diagram is that I think we need to talk about who lives in the green and doesn't care about the high cost of living. We have heard people who are being taken off other projects to do a $50 million home in Stowe. To maybe these are the folks who moved up here and decided their second home is their first home, but our income inequality and our number of second homeowners who don't want to look at anything else and don't care how much it hurts local people is something we need to talk about, that we cannot ignore. Because I don't think you just look at this and think, oh, of course, everybody wants to find the thing in the middle. You have to really get at the people who truly don't care how much the cost of living goes up and will still be able to afford in-home services and care and to get the contractor before other people do. That is a huge chunk of the economy that we have to pay attention to.
Yes, and a huge chunk of our construction workforce that are preoccupied.
And that's been pointed out to us, and I get in trouble for saying that out loud, but like, we
No, we've
can't
been-
protect that population any longer.
No, they're not our population, quite frankly. They're not our full-time residents.
So the ideas and the data, and it's not my data, it's our data. Use it as you see fit. And I hope it's a valuable resource to you. Thank you.
Thank
The
you.
best, Kevin.
Kevin, very helpful and much appreciated. And 2 years of work. Wow. Well done.
Are you
Well
like
done, Chamber.
phasing yourself out, or what is next? Like,
I hope I'm not phased out.
well, I don't know. Like, what, how are we keeping